Before I get started into the material and into the slides, I just want to give everyone a little bit of background on what it is that compelled me to do the research that led to this presentation, which I've now presented at a couple of conferences in addition to this webinar. In working with National SPI's clients, we started discovering a pattern or a trend when it came to lessons learned in projects and in teams. And that pattern was that people typically do a pretty decent job of capturing and collecting lessons learned with regard to what they've done well or what they didn't do so well in a project or in an endeavor. But it seemed to be quite pervasive that people across all industries and all domains failed to leverage those lessons learned or leverage that knowledge by accessing them and using them again in the future to save money or save time or in some cases just save annoyance or anguish. And so I wanted to understand that phenomenon. I wanted to understand why that was and why I was seeing that so much in all of the clients that my company works with. And so we did some surveys and we did some research that led to the material that I'm going to go through with you today. Now, I realize that some people out there may have a little bit slower refresh time in their connection, so I'm going to try to be very conscientious about telling you which slide I am talking about, and so you can keep up with me. I'm starting on slide 7, and I'm starting out with a quote from Confucius, and I'll tell you why I'm using this quote. It says, "By 3 methods we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is the noblest. Second, by imitation, which is the easiest. And third, by experience, which is the bitterest." And the reason I use that is because the place in this quote where lessons learned lives is really the second approach, by imitation, which in our lives, in our technical lives, in our managerial lives, is not only the easiest, but also the most cost-effective way to learn. We can't really reflect on things that we don't have knowledge of or we don't have exposure to. And unfortunately, many of us still today are learning by the third way, by online experience or actual experience in a situation. And Confucius said, well, that is the bitterest. Often it's the bitterest because it is the least cost-effective or the most expensive way to learn something. Also, before we move on, now I want to tell you that I'm using the phrase lessons learned. Some of you may use other phrases. Oftentimes projects will conduct at the end of the project something called a post-mortem or a postpartum. I don't use those phrases. They're kind of morbid and depressing to me, so I'm going to stick with lessons learned. But if those are the terms you use, then I'm not going to suggest you change your language. Just know that that's also what I'm talking about in this presentation. All right, on slide 8, this is some of the content that I'm going to go through today. I'm going to give you some definition on lessons learned, a working definition. It doesn't have to be yours, but it's the one we're using in this presentation. I'm going to talk just a little bit about how people in the world learn. There's 4 ways of learning, and we'll go through that very quickly. Talk about the value of lessons learned, what doesn't work, and then how to get people involved, some tips and techniques for getting people involved in lessons learned. And then I'm going to go through what we have found to be a very effective approach for implementing and institutionalizing a lessons learned program in your organization. And then, as Michael said, we'll take questions and answers at the end. So on slide 9, let's start with a working definition. It's interesting because if you go to Wikipedia or Wiktionary or do some searches and try to find a consensus or common definition for the phrase lessons learned, you'll get a lot of different things, and sometimes you may even find conflicting definitions. And so my staff and I poured through all of these, and we didn't really like any one of them, so we sort of built a hybrid definition of our own that works in our practice, in our consulting practice with clients. And that definition is, a lesson learned is a documented and shared experience concerning an action deemed worthy of promoting for its benefits or to warn others of its pitfalls. And so you can see in there, there's really kind of a number of key ideas. One is a lesson learned is documented. If it's not documented, we're not going to call it a lesson learned. Two, it can have one of two flavors. It can be something, a practice that you want to repeat in the future for its benefits, or it is a practice that you want to avoid in the future because of the cost or the waste associated with it. On slide 10, this graph, and by the way, this is an extrapolation from a book called Benchmarking for Best Practices. And so I wanted to give the proper attribution there. But this graph basically shows the 4 ways that human beings learn: vicarious learning or benchmarking, simulation, prototyping, and then online learning. And by the way, online learning is really not learning on, it's not really learning on the internet or on the web. Online learning in this context means experiential learning or learning through experience. And on this scale, if you look at this scale, on the left-hand side we have the cost of the learning from low to high, and on the x-axis we have the relevancy and the accuracy of the information that's being learned, again, from low to high. And so what you can see here is that experiential learning, which again means learning by what some people call the school of hard knocks, or learning the hard way, it has the highest accuracy and highest relevancy in terms of the information that you're gaining, but it also has the highest cost, as opposed to down at the lower end of the scale, we have lessons learned, which is a form of vicarious learning. Vicarious meaning I didn't actually experience the lesson myself, someone else experienced the lesson, and I'm learning from their experience. Now, vicarious learning on this scale has the lowest accuracy and relevancy in most cases, but it also has it's the lowest, cheapest way to learn. So I think that when we talk about lessons learned and we talk about the potential and the promise of lessons learned is the savings that we gain through applying lessons learned. So the trick here with lessons learned, as you can see, is we do want to make lessons learned somehow more accurate and relevant to future work while still harvesting those savings by not having to experience them personally. So let's talk about the value of lessons learned on slide 11 a little bit. And these are the reasons why people, come into work and say, I'm going to capture lessons learned and hopefully reuse them someday. This is the promise. The promise of lessons learned is that one person's lessons learned can enable rapid vicarious learning by many, many other people and save the organization time. So you can have almost a geometric scale in terms of the lesson propagating throughout the organization. One person can learn it experientially, but 1,000 people can benefit from that lesson. Lessons learned and implemented can reduce waste and rework and can save money. Process and product quality can improve by preventing repeated mistakes through lessons learned. And some people will have greater job satisfaction when learning is integrated with the work. There are people in the world who, yes, they like their paycheck, but they also like to learn on the job. That's one of there are people who consider learning and continuous learning as part of the compensation or the attraction of a particular job. Starting on slide 12, and I've got several slides that follow this, before I give you the approach that we have developed and that we've implemented that works in terms of implementing and institutionalizing